welcome to your deep dive on atomic habits. We've got all these excerpts you sent over, so clearly you're serious about, really getting into how these tiny changes can add up.
Yeah, and that's smart because it's so easy to get caught up in, those overnight success stories. But Atomic Habits really gets into the nitty-gritty of why those small habits, they're not just some productivity hack.
Right?
It's really about how our brains are literally wired for these small habits.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's really interesting because you clearly dug into the book. So
Mhm.
we're not just going to rehash the basics here, right? We're pulling out the most actionable points from what you saw in those excerpts.
It's like we're creating a highlight reel, but for your brain,
I love it.
to help you tackle whatever it is you're working towards.
Okay, so speaking of highlights, you can't talk about atomic habits without that idea of getting 1% better every day. I mean, it practically jumps out of the pages.
Right.
But there's one example that really stuck with me, and it's Clear's own story.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's such a powerful illustration of how those small wins, they can completely change your life's trajectory.
Mm.
He goes through this horrific accident, near fatal accident as a high school athlete, and then goes on to become this successful entrepreneur and author.
Right, and it makes you wonder about all those, famous overnight success stories.
Yeah.
How much work went in behind the scenes before that overnight moment,
Oh, absolutely. Years of work of showing up and making those 1% improvements.
Yeah.
Clear talks about how he applied those principles, even to building his business.
Yeah.
One tiny improvement at a time.
I mean, it really highlights that idea of simple interest versus compound interest. But instead of your money, it's like your efforts are compounding,
Exactly.
whether you realize it or not.
And this leads into a point that I find fascinating, and it's one that you highlighted. This shift from focusing on goals to focusing on identity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At first I was kind of like, wait, why would we forget about goals?
Yeah.
Like, what's the deal with that?
Because identity-based habits just have so much more staying power.
Okay.
Think of it this way. Goals are about what you achieve, but identity is about who you become.
Okay. I see where you're going with this.
So when your habits are rooted in, your values, who you are at your core,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes almost automatic.
Okay.
It's not so much about willpower in the moment. It's about, aligning your actions with the person you see yourself to be.
That reminds me of the example in the book with the smoker who's trying to quit.
It's a great one.
Yeah.
It's like the smoker who identifies as a non-smoker is way more likely to quit than someone who's just focused on, the act of smoking less or quitting.
Yeah, it's that self-image.
Yes.
If you see yourself as someone who takes care of their health, you're going to be way more likely to make those healthy choices.
Exactly. And then each time you make that healthy choice, you reinforce that identity.
Right.
But a lot of times these choices, they stem from habits that we've developed.
Yeah.
And these habits, they can feel like they're running on autopilot.
Totally. Like, you don't even realize you're doing them half the time.
Exactly.
Which is where that whole concept of the habit loop comes in, right?
Yes.
And I love how he uses that analogy of, the worn paths in the forest.
Oh, yeah. It's such a great visual, right?
It is. It really stuck with me. Like, every time we're thinking a thought or doing something, it's like we're carving out a path.
Yes.
And the more you travel that path, the deeper it gets. And then it's just, so easy to fall into it.
And our brains, they're always looking for the path of least resistance.
Right. Like, our brains are just trying to save energy wherever they can.
Exactly. And that's where habits come in. It's like the well-trodden path our brains rely on to, conserve energy. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
This habit loop, it doesn't just happen randomly.
Mm.
It follows, this specific 4-step process.
Hit me with it. What are the 4 steps?
So Clear calls them cue, craving, response, and reward. Like
Mm.
any loop, it all starts with a cue, and that cue triggers your brain to initiate a behavior
Okay.
by hinting at a reward.
Okay, so let's say my cue is seeing a notification pop up on my phone.
Right.
What happens next?
So that's where the craving comes in. And that's the motivational force behind the habit. It's that,
Yep.
desire for the change in state that habit will deliver.
So it's not that I'm I don't crave scrolling through social media endlessly.
Right.
It's more that I'm craving feeling connected or distracted or whatever that is.
Exactly. And that's such an important distinction to make.
Yeah.
So, you have the cue, you have the craving, and then the response is the actual habit itself.
Okay.
So in this case, picking up your phone and scrolling.
Right.
But then comes the reward, and that's what, reinforces that entire loop.
So the rewards would be that feeling of, okay, I know what's going on, or
Yeah.
I got to escape for a few minutes, or what.
Exactly. And because it feels good, Even if it's just momentarily, our brains,
Right.
they file that away for next time.
They're like, let's do that again.
Exactly.
And it's so funny because, like, we don't even realize it's happening most of the time.
Right. It can be so automatic
Yeah.
that we're like not even conscious of it.
Like in that story you mentioned with the paramedic who, like, she just knew her
Yeah.
father-in-law was having a heart attack, even though, like, on the surface, he seemed fine.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of how our brains can pick up on these really subtle cues
Right.
without us even realizing it.
Yeah, without us knowing why.
And, she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was,
Right.
but years of experience had, like, wired her brain to connect those dots.
That's both amazing and kind of creepy, honestly.
Right.
Like, our brains are super powerful.
They are.
But the thing is, like, this whole habit loop thing can work for us or against us, right?
Exactly. It's a double-edged sword. And that's why, understanding these 4 steps, the cue, the craving, the response, the reward, it's so crucial.
Okay, so how do we hack it?
Well, you start to look for those cues. What is it that's driving your current habits, good or bad?
Okay.
And how can you make those rewards for the good habits even more satisfying?
Ooh, I like that. Okay, so I'm already, like, mentally redoing my entire morning routine as we speak. But, another point that you brought up in the excerpts was this idea that, like, motivation is kind of, it's overrated.
It is.
And it's really our environment that has a way bigger impact.
It's so true. We put so much emphasis on willpower,
Yeah.
and we kind of forget about, the influence our surroundings have on us.
Like that study about the hospital cafeteria, right?
Yes.
Where they just rearranged where the drinks were.
Yes.
And it, like, significantly changed how much water people were drinking.
Such a simple tweak, right?
Right.
Just making it more visible, and suddenly everyone's, more likely to choose it.
Okay, so it's not about, like, mustering up all this willpower. It's more about being, like, smart with my surroundings.
Exactly.
Okay, so what are, like, some tweaks I can make in my own life, to my own environment,
Yeah.
to, like, help me with the habits I actually want to build?
Well, that's a great question. Take a look around your own life right now and ask yourself, are there any areas where, maybe your environment is working against your goals?
Okay.
Like, is your phone always right there
Ooh, yes.
tempting you?
100%.
Or maybe, you have unhealthy snacks like right out on the counter.
And me, I'm, like, reaching for my phone without even thinking about it half the time.
Exactly. But here's the good news. You can use this to your advantage.
Okay, how?
So instead of relying on willpower, what if you just, like, put your phone in another room while you're working?
Okay.
Or, you swap out those unhealthy snacks for a bowl of fruit.
So it's like you're setting yourself up for success before you even start.
Exactly. You're designing your environment to work for you, not against you.
Love that. Okay,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And, speaking of making things easier, that's where that 2-minute rule comes in, right?
Yes.
And I know you mentioned earlier, like, I was saying I was struggling to, like, get a writing routine going.
Right.
And it feels very overwhelming.
Well, imagine if instead of aiming for a whole chapter, you just committed to 2 minutes of writing.
Okay, I got to be honest. That sounds a little too easy.
That's the beauty of it.
But, like, how does just 2 minutes make a difference?
Because starting is the hardest part
Yep.
with any habit. So, by making that initial action so ridiculously simple, you're reducing that friction.
So it's less about the task itself and more about just, like, getting over that hump to
Exactly.
get started.
And often, those 2 minutes is all it takes to get the ball rolling.
Yeah, I can see that.
And then once you're in motion,
Right.
it's much easier to stay in motion.
It's like that feeling when you really don't want to go for a run.
Yes, exactly.
But then you, like, put your shoes on and get out the door and you're like, okay, this isn't so bad.
Yeah.
It's the worst part is over.
The hardest part is over.
Okay, so we've talked about making good habits easier, but what about those, like, pesky bad habits? The ones that are, like, really hard to break.
Right.
We kind of touched on this before with, like, the phone example and, like, putting it in another room.
Yes.
But are there other things we can do to make bad habits less appealing?
He does. He actually suggests using what he called commitment devices,
Okay.
which is just, a fancy way of saying you're putting obstacles in the way of your bad habits.
So, like, if I'm trying to write, but I keep ending up watching TV instead,
Right?
I should probably, like, unplug my TV and hide the remote.
Exactly. Or if online shopping is, your vice,
Oh, yeah.
get rid of that saved credit card info.
Ooh, that's smart.
Make it harder to, like, just click and buy.
So it's all about making it harder, like increasing that friction.
Exactly. It's about making it less effortless to do the thing that, you're trying to avoid in the first place.
He gave that funny example with Victor Hugo,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
where
Yeah.
like he literally had his assistant lock up all of his clothes
It's extreme.
except for like a shawl, so he couldn't leave the house to go get coffee
Commitment.
until he finished writing.
Yeah.
Uh,
I don't know if I'd go that far, but,
maybe not that far.
it's an idea.
You can use those same principles in our own lives.
I like it. Okay, so we've talked about making good habits easier, bad habits harder.
Right.
But ultimately, it really comes down to our brain's reward system, right?
Yeah.
We're like hardwired to want that instant gratification.
Exactly. We want that, immediate reward, that dopamine hit.
And that's where that fourth law of behavior change comes in, right?
Yes.
Make it satisfying.
Make it enjoyable.
Because a lot of times, like, the immediate outcome of a good habit isn't always that fun. Right. It's not always like a party.
Not a party.
Oh.
Like eating a salad is not as fun as eating pizza in the moment.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I think a lot of people get tripped up. We're so focused on that end goal, that like big, achievement,
Right.
that we kind of forget to make the process itself enjoyable.
You're so busy like white knuckling it to the finish line that
Yeah.
you're like, wait, I'm miserable.
Right. And Clear reminds us that you can hack your brain's reward system, even with those habits that don't feel super exciting in the moment.
Yeah, and I love that example you gave earlier with the couple saving for a trip to Europe.
Oh, yeah.
They made it fun, right?
They did. They gamified it.
Yeah.
Every time they skipped eating out, they
Right.
transfer that money into, this account that was specifically labeled like trip to Europe.
So smart, because then it's like you're not just like, oh, I'm putting this money in my savings account.
Right.
It's like I am this much closer to, my dream vacation.
And you see that progress,
You
right?
do. It's visual.
Yeah.
And they actually like did it right. They ended up saving up enough to go on their trip.
They
did.
did, which just shows you the power of,
Yeah.
designing those rewards to really align with your goals and to make the journey itself, more enjoyable.
I love it. Okay, so we've covered so much ground today.
We have.
We talked about the habit loop.
Mhm.
We talked about our environment, our reward system.
All those little tweaks you can make.
I know. But if you had to choose just one thing from everything we talked about today, what would you want listeners to take away from Atomic Habits?
Honestly, for me, it always comes back to those 1% improvements.
Okay.
It's easy to get caught up in wanting those big, sweeping, overnight transformations.
Yeah, totally.
But real change, lasting change comes from consistency.
Okay.
It comes from those small actions, day after day after day.
So falling in love with the process. And like you were saying earlier, like becoming that person who,
Exactly.
it's not about the goal, it's about who you're becoming along the way.
Absolutely. And Atomic Habits reminds us that we have more power than we think.
Yeah.
You can design your life one small habit at a time.
I love that. So as you continue to reflect on Atomic Habits and everything that we talked about today,
Yes.
what's one tiny change, 1% improvement that you can make this week? Think of it as your open-ended question, something to spark that habit loop
I love that.
and start you on that journey of becoming the best version of yourself.